Just a little bit about me. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology at UNM, and I specialize in Southwest archaeology. My research interests include ancestral Pueblo archaeology, the archaeology of Chaco Canyon, and issues surrounding how material culture is really enmeshed in every aspect of social identity and ritual performance. So most of my research over the last 10 years has revolved around Chacoan personal adornment or jewelry. This was the subject of my dissertation work, which included the analyses of the enormous ornament assemblages from Pueblo Bonito and Aztec ruin here in New Mexico. And then also sort of carrying that topic forward through several papers. As Phil mentioned, I recently published a volume on the subject of bodily adornment and social identity. And this is actually more of like a global archaeological perspective. So there's chapters in here from, like a Norwegian archaeologist who specializes in Viking jewelry and sort of all around the globe. And it's pretty exciting. So in the pre-Hispanic Southwest, the objects that we typically categorize as jewelry were often also placed in special contexts like ritual offerings. So while I was initially interested in jewelry, it became obvious that these materials had a lot of social and spiritual value in this region beyond, simply adornment or sort of, expressing one's identity. So this really sort of led me down a different path where, now I'm sort of exploring how these objects are interrelated with past cosmology. So the assignment of specific colors to directions is a common practice in traditional societies around the globe. And while a variation of color groupings have been documented worldwide, those including sets of 4 are particularly widespread in Asia and the Americas, as it turns out. And indigenous North American color schemes, where they've been recorded, are predominantly quaternary in that they involve a 4-fold division, sort of loosely approximated by the recognized cardinal directions. More accurately, though, they really correspond to what we call world quarters. And the boundaries between these differ from sort of our conventional Western cartographic partition. So here on the left, you can see sort of the classic, Western compass rose, where, the quadrants are defined along these north, south, east, west axes, while our inner cardinal points, like northeast, southwest, are in the middle of those quadrants. And on the right, you can see sort of a simplified model of a world quarter system where the quadrants encompass the direction that they reference. So in North America, not only is this quaternary system really predominant, but there are also certain colors that are repeated over and over again that are assigned to one of these 4 colors. So these include, not uncommonly, blue and green are sometimes substituted for one of these basic colors. And here you can see an excerpt. This is sort of from a really interesting study by an archaeologist by the name of Warren DeBurr, and he did this survey of North American indigenous groups and sort of documented their different color directional schemes. And so here's just an example. Here we've got the group, we've got, the direction, and then the letter standing for the color that they're assigning to that quadrant. Here, the U stands for blue or green. So North American indigenous groups, including many of the Pueblos, often combine blue and green together into a single category. And this is both sort of conceptually and reflected in language. So sort of interesting here, I sort of summarized Debur's data by proportions. And what you can really see is there's a lot of variation. While these are sort of the basic colors that are associated with directions, it really varies pretty widely which direction is assigned which color. And it really seems to be something that's pretty culturally specific. Here I bolded sort of what's, the color that's, sort of highest represented within his sample of North American sample. So the Pueblos are very linguistically diverse. They speak 8 languages, numerous dialects thereof. And yet ethnographic research has shown that there's really this broadly shared understanding of the cosmos as synary, which is 6-part. So in this system, the universe consists of 6 divisions. So this includes north, south, east, west quadrants or world quarters, as well as a zenith or above and a nadir or below. And each of these is typically linked to one of 5 main colors, white, red, black, yellow, or blue-green, plus either a kind of like a multicolored or rainbow category or a lighter or darker version of one of the main colors. Not uncommonly, these directions are also often associated with like important substances like tobacco or water or stones or seashells or certain seasons, certain animals, or certain plants, but it really sort of varies community to community. It's clear from both the ethnographic literature and information shared by members of modern descendant communities that directionality really permeates traditional Pueblo life. And this includes everything from the orientation of architecture to shrines, offerings, but also more intangible elements like prayers, dances, processions, song sequences, ritual narratives. And often, I'm not going to go into this too much in this talk, but important to this too is the concept of circuitry. So not only these directions, but the sort of direction one is, or order one is to proceed through these directions. So Pueblo ritual circuits are largely based on solar movements in relation to center places. So such as kivas or plazas or villages. And so this includes both the sun's sort of east to west path each day, and then also its seasonal course from summer to winter solstice. And much of the traditional Pueblo ceremonial and agricultural calendar is determined by the rising and setting of the sun at certain places on the horizon, sort of as it moves from solstice to solstice, or north to south and back again. So given the established ancestral connection between the Pueblos and the pre-Hispanic inhabitants of the northern Southwest, and archaeological evidence of underlying continuities, at least some continuities between ritual architecture and practice pre and post contact, I think it's probable that the past residents of the region likely shared some of these similar general ideas related to directionality. And to examine this, I think if anywhere in the ancestral alignment is perhaps most exemplified in the architecture of Chaco Canyon. So as I'm sure most of you already are well familiar with Chaco Canyon, but it is located in northwest New Mexico. It lies at the center of this vast ancestral Pueblo social network that stretches across the larger Four Corners region. It encompassed, over 100,000 square kilometers, and it includes at least 230 large Chaco-style masonry structures known as great houses. Thousands of smaller sites clustered around these great houses, and hundreds of pre-Hispanic road segments. So the first distinctive architectural elements of the Chacoan system first coalesced in the canyon itself at the beginning of the 9th to 10th century AD. And then they reached their greatest sort of elaboration or geographic extent by the 12th century AD. The canyon itself contains a sort of dense concentration of 15 great houses, the largest of which is Pueblo Bonito. Here in this aerial photograph, you can see several of these great houses. This is what we call sort of downtown Chaco. And here's Pueblo Bonito right here, this D-shaped structure. Okay, so Pueblo Bonito, here as you can see in these two aerial photographs, it's estimated to have had between 600 and 800 rooms originally, and to have stood up to 4 stories in some places. It was actually first built in the late AD 800s, so pretty early. In addition to just the sheer size of the building, some of the unique aspects of Pueblo Bonito include the presence of 2 elite mortuary crypts, caches of unique ritual objects all across the structure, and goods imported from across the Southwest and even Mesoamerica. So all this indicates that, Pueblo Bonito seems to have served as a kind of cultural or ceremonial hub for its surrounding region. Now, the site has been the focus of intense archaeological study for over 100 years. It's probably one of the most intensively researched archaeological areas in the world, I think. Pueblo Bonito itself is fully excavated. This was completed through 2 large excavations, the Hyde Exploring Expedition, which was carried out in partnership with the American Museum of Natural History in the 1890s, and then the National Geographic Society expedition in the 1920s. And this was completed in partnership with the Smithsonian. So this is why Pueblo Bonito's artifacts are largely housed in museums in those institutions on the East Coast. It's because of the sort of history of excavation versus being here in New Mexico. So beginning in the 1970s, researchers began to note alignments and patterns in the spatial distribution of structures in the canyon. Anna Sofer, who is an archaeoastronomer, documented alignments between great houses and certain solar events, in addition to the now famous sun dagger petroglyph that's on Fajada Butte that marks solstices, equinoxes, and maybe even lunar standstills. In Pueblo Bonito itself, the builders did attend to these directional alignments. So it's oriented along cardinal axes. Its exterior front wall, so extends east-west, and it's aligned with sunset and sunrise on fall equinox. And then it has this really conspicuous interior dividing wall that runs almost exactly north-south. And interestingly, the pueblos in the canyon also appear to be arranged relative to one another along directional axes. And it's thought that this reflects a kind of sacred geometry in the canyon that incorporates roads, ceremonial structures, and prominent natural features. So not that different than sort of the different alignments and arrangements that have been documented sort of ethnographically and historically for the pueblos. So given this attention to directional alignment in Pueblo Bonito, formal and uniform ritual structures or kivas at the site, and the presence of deposits in those kivas that include materials of different colors. I think that Pueblo Bonito's kivas are really sort of an ideal case study for examining Chacoan concepts regarding color and direction. So Pueblo Bonito contains 35 kivas. This is more than any other Chacoan great house. In the northern Southwest, the kiva form has deep historical roots. So between around 6500 BC and 700 AD, so before the widespread appearance of above ground architecture or residential architecture, people in the region typically lived in pit structures, sort of ovoid to circular pit structures. And these features sort of increased in formality over time and sometimes included offerings that were placed beneath the floors or in wall niches or in storage bins or in ventilator tunnels, even while they were serving a residential purpose. So after residential occupation shifted to above ground pueblos in the central and southern San Juan Basin, pit structures then became the focus of ceremonial activities. So there seems to be sort of an evolution between the pit house form to the kiva form through time. And this may be because of their connection with ancestral time, sort of referencing an older architectural style. In most Pueblo origin stories, humans emerged from underground through a series of vertically stacked worlds. And so it's sort of tempting to interpret kivas as, symbolically representative of both an earlier architectural form and sort of this aspect of traditional history. So among the Pueblos, individual kivas are typically associated with defined social segments, either kin-based clans or ritual sodalities. And these groups have varying degrees of political authority or in ritual responsibility, depending on the specific community. So, I guess we need to ask then, what is the extent to which we can sort of apply these organizational structures that were observed sort of post-Spanish contact to the past, to the pre-Hispanic sort of period. And so that's debated, and particularly in light of the fact that there is evidence that Chacoan society involved a greater degree of social stratification and political centralization than has been documented for the Pueblos, which appear to be more egalitarian. So although the basic kiva form is found throughout the ancestral Pueblo region, but the specific architectural elements that comprise those kivas really varies by geographic location. Within sort of Chacoan culture, kivas seem to be divided into three sort of main categories. And these sort of divided by archaeologists into different categories. And these are great kivas, court kivas, and room block kivas. So great kivas are the largest. They're anywhere from 10 to 20 meters in diameter. They could have accommodated the most people or ritual participants. And there have been several estimates of what the audience capacity would have been for these structures. They range all the way up to 250 people per structure, but most seem to range from about 60 to about 200, somewhere in there. And great house communities typically only have one or two great kivas. So this suggests that they were likely sort of these locales of communal or sort of large scale ceremonial activity. But apart from their large sizes, great kivas in Chaco are also distinguished by the sort of suite of architectural traits that included roofing structures supported by 4 absolutely massive timber posts, and this sort of set of distinctive interior features. So there's this interior masonry bench that runs around the perimeter that was likely used for seating. There are these 2 raised masonry vaults flanking the hearth or firebox. There are typically these little wall niches perimeter of the structure and appear to have contained offerings. And interesting, some of the great kivas at Chaco also appear to be aligned to solar events, such that the roof or wall openings sort of channel light into the interior of these structures in really distinctive ways, particularly during summer solstice. However, my study, I focus on smaller kivas. And one of the reasons for this is that, unfortunately, there aren't that many intact great kiva deposits or offerings that were recovered during excavation. And there are a couple different reasons for this. Largely, these were sort of noted by excavators. The objects were sort of scattered along the floor. These structures were remodeled repeatedly. It may be that some of the roofs were the timbers were taken off to, sort of after, occupation declined in the canyon, that the timbers may have been removed, or the structures were ritually terminated through burning. So for various reasons, we don't have a lot of good intact offerings from those great kivas, unfortunately. But I really want to focus on another category of kiva. These are called court kivas, and these are much smaller. They're only about 4 to 8 meters in diameter, and they are located either within plazas or actually surrounded by rooms within the pueblo itself. And court kivas are far more numerous than great kivas at Chaco and great houses. Nearly 80% of Pueblo Bonito's kivas fall into this court kiva category. And this term was coined by the archaeologist Tom Wines, and he defined these structures by, again, a suite of the really distinctive interior features. So one of these includes the presence of these low masonry roof support pillars known as pilasters, radial log pilasters. And here they're denoted here around the structure. And they actually sit on top of the masonry bench. Court kivas all have a ventilator tunnel that points to the south or near it. They have a prominent recess in the bench above the ventilator, also, to the south. Often they have this little niche that's placed in the northern portion of the bench. There is usually a fire pit that's located either centrally or in the south central portion of the floor. And then finally, this sort of rectangular sort of subfloor masonry vault that's to the west of the fire pit. So all the court kivas, these are very standardized, uniform interior features. Room block kivas are mostly defined by their small size, but lacking these set of features. So pilasters served as the supports for the lower portions of cribbed log roofs. So these are these domed superstructures comprised of imported timbers that were stacked in courses. And court kivas likely were roofed with anywhere from 150 to 300 timbers, which of course had to be manually brought into Chaco Canyon from some distance away. Here you can see this is a historic a photo. This is actually from the 1920s excavations. This is an excavated court kiva, Kiva L. And you can see these masonry pilasters here and the lower portion of that those crib roof structure actually sitting directly on those pilasters. So unlike a great kiva, people wouldn't have been able to sit on the interior bench because it would have been occupied by the roofing structure. Here you can see an example of an intact portion of an amazingly well-preserved cribbed kiva roof. This is actually from southeastern Utah, but I included it just to give you an idea sort of the roof structure. And again, note that the lower course of timbers are supported on the bench. So at the core of each Chacoan court kiva pilaster is a shortened portion of a log, a segment of a timber that's oriented parallel to the bench surface. And so this is why they're called radial log pilasters. So here you can see the end of one of these timbers exposed in this pilaster. And then it appears that most of these masonry pilasters were covered over in plaster originally. The other fascinating thing about these pilasters is that in just about every single one, they have a little hole or cavity that's been carved into the top of this radial log. So through the masonry pilaster into this log, a little repository where objects were placed. And then this little cavity was capped either by a little circular plug of wood or sort of an adobe cap. And then, of course, the lower course of timbers was placed over this. So this tells us that these deposits would have been inaccessible while this structure was being used. You would have had to disassemble the entire roof in order to access these little repositories. So it was likely that they were served as sort of dedicatory offerings when the structure was actually built. This is kind of interesting photo, again, an old excavation photo. Here's this sort of, by this bent spoon is you can just barely see the top of this little plug of this pilaster offering. So as I mentioned earlier, the majority of Pueblo Bonito was excavated, it's over 100 years ago now, which is amazing. But working with these really old sort of legacy projects and their collections presents some unique challenges in terms of the amount of detailed documentation that you have to work with, especially considering, this was really like the infancy of scientific archaeology. Fortunately for this study, both of the projects generally did assign unique numbers to the pilasters within each of these kivas. And then this number was then carried over to the objects that were found within that pilaster repository. It got a little tricky in that there were no published figures that actually showed the numbers of the pilasters. So, for example, there'd be a group of objects and it was like, Kiva L, pilaster 4, right? And it's like, well, what's pilaster 4, So it took a little doing and some sleuthing to figure out, what their numbering system was, to look at sort of old notes and old photos and things like that. But in all, I was able to determine, the orientations of 140 pilasters in 22 different court kivas. And I measured this both with respect to the azimuth degrees and with respect to directional quadrants. So that's what you see here. Here is the actual bearing, and then here is the directional world quarter that it would correspond to. Interestingly, while the number of pilasters varies in court kivas, they all have either 6, 8, or 10. So all even numbers, it's all one of these configurations. And the 6 pilaster configuration is actually the most common. So here you can see the bearing of all the, the averages of all the pilaster 1s. So pilaster 1 ended up being the first pilaster directly to the east of the southern ventilator tunnel. And then they were numbered counterclockwise from there. All right. So the bearing of these ventilator tunnels and these bench recesses of the court kivas do vary slightly in orientation across the structure. So here you can see sort of their distribution and their orientation. So they all vary from south-southwest to south-southeast, but definitely clustering around south. And when I looked at all of their bearings together, they had a sort of a mean deviation from true south of just. So it appears that court kivas were intended to be structured relative to this north-south axis, despite slight disparities relative to like a true south compass bearing. But even this, small disparity is actually pretty amazing and really is a testament to the skill of the Chacoan builders. There's this little variation across the structure, with a lack of modern engineering tools. So given that, court kivas are sort of meant to lie along the sort of north-south axis, I measured the orientations of the pilasters kind of with respect to the arrangement of the interior features of the kiva itself. So positioning the southern ventilator tunnels. So here you can see that's what these are in the middle of the southern directional quadrant. And then I measured the bearings of all the pilasters from there. And doing this, it was really just amazing how uniform the orientations of these pilasters are across the whole structure. So, individual pilaster bearings vary an average of only 2 degrees from one another across all court kivas. So, for example, pilaster ones across all the court kivas of the structure, right? They're within like a couple degrees of each other. It's pretty amazing. All right, so of the 140 pilasters that I could determine their sort of directional orientation, from those 90 pilasters had objects that were curated at the Smithsonian and the American Museum of Natural History, which is pretty amazing, I think, considering the century this passed in between their collection and now. So here in the top, you can again see this is all the court kivas in Pueblo Bonito, shaded in blue. The bottom figure shows all the court kivas in my sample. So all those where they both had these objects that were still associated with their pilaster numbers, and that these are kivas where I could determine the orientation of the pilasters, where there was enough information available. So in total, these deposits included over 10,000 individual items. And I analyzed these over the course of about 6 years or so. And this was actually part of a larger National Science Foundation funded research project that was focused on the ornaments. So while I was primarily focused on the jewelry for that study, because the majority of the objects placed in these offerings are ornaments or materials that were used to make ornaments, like marine shell or turquoise, bits of broken ornaments, little flakes of turquoise and things like that. I included them in my study. So the specific contents of each of these kiva pilaster repositories are unique, but the same general materials and forms occur repeatedly. So the most commonly represented materials are like turquoise, marine shell, jet, shale, and mineral pigments. And then, there were occasionally other kinds of objects, including things like galena, gypsum or selenite, quartz crystals, bits of, flake stone debitage, raptor or carnivore claws or teeth, worked bird bone, fossils, sort of interesting looking shaped rocks. And also in a couple cases, actually feathers that were still preserved, which is pretty neat. So what I did is I divided these materials into basic color groups. So white, red, black, blue, green, and yellow. And then in addition, just because I was curious, I also included a multicolored category, which is pretty much only comprised of abalone shell, and then also a translucent category, because I was interested to see if these were associated with directions. And, of course, color categories are, fairly subjective, actually. They were informed by my own cultural context, right, and background and worldview, but they do encompass sort of the major color groups that are recognized by the Pueblos as most sort of cosmologically significant. And I also a single category again, based on that sort of conceptual and linguistic intermixing of the two among historically documented pueblos. So proportionally, turquoise and marine shell objects dominate my sample. And this isn't surprising at all, actually, considering these are the most common materials that are included in ritual deposits of all kinds across the ancestral Pueblo world, as has been the case actually, for over 2,000 years. So it's an amazingly long tradition, this sort of valuing of these two materials. And it should also be noted that most of these little repositories, most of their assemblages contained, objects from multiple color categories, right? So it's not like all the white objects were in one and all the blue objects were in another. So they were mixed. Interestingly, so like I said, white and blue green seem to have been especially valued materials, for a host of different reasons. I'm going to sort of come back to that at the end of the talk, but they sort of seem to comprise a base to which other colors would then be added. So I think they had, multiple meanings sort of depending on their context. So this is sort of the big results. Statistically, there are significant associations between the relative frequency of artifacts of different color categories and the directional quadrants of the pilasters in which they're found. So south with blue-green, east with white, and west with red. Also, other associations I found, but that weren't as statistically significant, include black with north, and then multicolored with also with northern quadrants. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough translucent materials. This is primarily actually quartz crystals. I didn't have enough in my sample to really be able to look at them statistically. Okay, so I was also interested, okay, so there's these associations with colors and, these sort of maybe world quarters, and that's really cool. But I started thinking about, what might lie along those directions from Chaco. So sort of as another layer of directional citation, I was curious if maybe these pilaster deposits referenced, not only these sort of basic sacred directions, but maybe they were referencing physical features on the Chacoan landscape, maybe important landforms or raw material sources. So prominent mountains, mesas, and geological formations are ingrained in Pueblo oral history as cultural or cosmographic boundary markers or places associated with specific events and characters from traditional history, migration histories, certain ceremonial practices, associated with certain, say, mountaintops and things like that. So here are just a few of the landforms within and surrounding the San Juan Basin that are considered sacred in various Pueblo traditions. We've got Shiprock, Huerfano Mesa, the Jemez Mountains, the Chusca Mountains, Mount Taylor, the Zuni Mountains, Cabazon Peak, among others. And I think it's also important to point out that while, the relationship of Chaco's great houses to these sort of celestial cycles receives a lot of public attention, but actually the alignment of great houses and shrines, Chacoan shrines, to one another and to these sort of conspicuous physical features is actually more typical of Chacoan architectural practice. So of all the pilaster orientations, south, southeast, and west are associated with the most objects. And blue-green materials are particularly concentrated in south-southeast oriented pilasters. And in fact, south-southeast oriented pilasters contain almost 4 times the amount of turquoise recovered from nearby pilasters. So 4 times the amount recovered from east, south, southeast, east, southeast oriented pilasters combined. So this really indicates that this specific direction was purposefully emphasized of these kivas. And this pattern could be connected to an older ancestral Pueblo tradition in the San Juan Basin of acknowledging this direction through architecture. So 5 of the 7 early great houses, so they're founded in the 800s and early 900s in the canyon, have the whole Pueblo is oriented south-southeast. And in fact, you can see here in this map, outlined in red is the earlier, what Pueblo Bonito originally looked like, sort of in its earliest form, this sort of small arc. And as you can see, it is also oriented south-southeast, actually in the same directional bearing as that south-southeast pilaster in the court kivas. So in thinking about this, you know, this veneration of this particular direction, both in Pueblo layout and then in ritual deposition, I thought, well, you know, what's along south-southeast? Well, Mount Taylor is actually. Mount Taylor is located south-southeast of much of the Central Basin and from Pueblo Bonito, and it's actually at exactly the same bearing from Pueblo Bonito as the structure was oriented in its earliest stage. You know, the mountain has a really prominent role in traditional Pueblo narratives, sometimes even associated with the color blue-green or with turquoise. So that's south-southeast, right? That was one of the orientations, pilaster orientations that contain a lot of objects. And the other one is western pilasters. So western pilasters also contain a lot of blue-green materials, not as much as south-southeast, but and then also those oriented to the northwest. So these directional bearings are consistent with the locations of the Chusca Mountains right here, as in for west, and Shiprock for northwest. So the Chusca Mountains were a really important source of lithic raw material for the Chacoans, and communities in the Chusca area produced a significant amount of the pottery that was used by Pueblo Bonito's residents. And then Shiprock, you know, this dramatic volcanic landform that projects, you know, hundreds of meters above its surrounding area. And it may have served as, you know, an important visual connection perhaps between communities north and south of the San Juan River, as proposed by Ruth Van Dyke in her viewshed analyses. Okay, so that was looking at these directional, you know, how these landforms are associated with potentially with pilasters. So another possibility I explored was that maybe the orientations of these offerings are referencing directions, you know, of the material sources, you know, direction that they came from originally. So I sort of explored this. So let's start with marine shell. So marine shell is obviously exotic to the canyon, the nearest coast, you know, 700 kilometers to the southwest. The main mollusk genera represented in the kiva offering assemblage include Olivella, Spondylus, and Glycymrus. So these are all found in the Gulf of California. And then Haliotis or abalone, which is from the Southern California Pacific coast. However, most of the marine shell actually occurs in eastern pilasters. And the only source of shell that would be in that direction would be the Gulf of Mexico, and no Gulf of Mexico species of shell have been found in the material culture of Pueblo Bonito or of Chacoan sites. And so next I looked at a couple different kinds of non-local lithic material. So Chusca chert and obsidian. So here we've got the Chusca Mountains right there. That was a source of Washington Pass or Chusca chert. It's about 80 kilometers to the west of the canyon. And then obsidian that was used in the canyon originates in a couple different areas. one, the Jemez Mountains, another Mount Taylor, right, southeast of the canyon, and then also the Red Hill area, which is southwest of the canyon. Materials were primarily found in northern pilasters, right? So not the direction from which they were sourced. Okay, and then finally, looking at turquoise. So there have been various sourcing studies of turquoise objects from the canyon, and these conclude that, you know, the turquoise was actually from all over the place. It was, you know, sort of originally thought that the Chacoans would use the closest turquoise source, which is the Cerrillos Hills near Santa Fe. And they definitely did use Cerrillos turquoise, but it turns out they also used many other sources as well. However, 50 to 60% of the turquoise that has been part of these sourcing projects is from sources to the west, especially in Nevada. And then about 40% is from the east, so from like the Cerrillos area. And yet the majority of the turquoise is in these like southern quadrant pilasters, right? So again, sort of opposite. So overall, it doesn't appear that, you know, the builders of these kivas were distributing objects according to the direction that the materials like originally derived. Okay, so based on my results, this is kind of what, you know, I think a direct quaternary directional color scheme might look like for Pueblo Bonito, again with a question mark with the black, since that's not a very strong association. So how do these patterns compare to the color directional schemes that have been documented for the Pueblos? So what stands out the most, I think, in this comparison is that they're white and yellow. So the association of white with east is shared by, you know, both in Pueblo Bonito and with all of the Pueblos, actually. And while yellow is present in all the historic Pueblo quaternary color systems, it's not represented in Pueblo Bonito's directional offerings. In yellow, pigment, primarily in the form of limonite and yellow ochre, is generally present at Pueblo Bonito, both as a raw material and as a residue on groundstone palettes. Here you can see both red ochre and limonite residue on a paint palette. It's also found in a range of contexts at the site, from domestic refuse to deposits associated with burials and ritual storage areas. So this suggests that yellow was, in fact, socially meaningful at Pueblo Bonito, but perhaps it just wasn't as sort of enmeshed in this sort of directional or georitual citation as other colorful materials. So what I think is really interesting, although, you know, Pueblo Bonito's directional color scheme does seem to vary from those documented from the Pueblos, I think what's interesting, though, is that it is a quaternary directional color scheme. So it indicates a sort of endurance of a general cosmology that involves sort of this minimally, right, a fourfold division where colors are assigned to directions, and you know, that this persisted for, you know, 800 to 900 years after the end of the Chacoan system. So this sort of cosmography includes sort of the universe, again, divided into these world quarter directions related to colors, sacred features perhaps involved in this on the local landscape, and also this really similar suite, right, of potent, powerful substances like turquoise and marine shell. In that book that was recently published, I have a chapter in there that looks at this long-lived tradition of ritual deposition across the northern Southwest, not just at Chaco. And I sort of look at sort of what are the patterns, you know, over like 2,000 years and what's included in these, you know, really special contexts. And it is pretty amazing how similar it is. This is a very long-lived tradition in this area. And what's interesting too is that, like Pueblo Bonito's Corte Kiva deposits and these other ritual deposits in other settings from other time periods in the northern Southwest, is that these materials appear, whether they are, a finished, beautiful, or a broken bead, whether they are, unworked completely in just a natural specimen of something, whether they are a piece of turquoise matrix, right, that you couldn't work into something, right, because it's not pure enough, or just the small little flakes and chips from jewelry production. And the same goes with other substances like blue and red pigments, for example. And so these materials seem to have been valued no matter what form they appeared in. And this suggests that they were thought to have these sort of intrinsic properties or potencies. And I think that, based on what we know of the value of these materials from ethnographic sources, often they're associated with these sort of powers to sanctify, to protect, to sort of ensoul, or to animate what they're associated with, whether that be an individual, whether that be a structure, whether that be a group of objects that they're placed with. And so I think it's likely that they were included in these deposits so that they're sort of symbolically supporting, right, these, and actually literally the pilasters are literally supporting these really heavy, elaborate, expensive cribbed roofs, right, of these really special structures. We've got, timbers that are coming from very far away, right? These are really valuable structures. And then finally, I also want to reference some more recent research of other archaeologists. So both Indigenous and other anthropological scholars have suggested that in several Pueblo communities, kiva roofs are sort of reference both the sky and an inverted basket. And these two concepts are linked in Tewa language and cosmology. So archaeologist Scott Ortman suggests that, for example, ancestral Pueblo kivas in the Mesa Verde region, right north of Chaco, are material metaphors for containers, specifically that kiva walls are sort of analogous to pottery bowls and the roofs to coiled baskets. And this is based on both linguistic evidence and material evidence. So like the kiva walls being painted similar to pottery bowls, sort of reference to this, the sky as the sky basket. If you looked up underneath a cribbed roof, it would look like an inverted basket. And Tewa, Hopi, and Zuni cosmology also view the earth as a kind of like a pottery bowl. And so in this perspective, then a kiva sort of symbolizes the earth and its cribbed roof sort of represents the sky. And so if we kind of extend this metaphor that, kiva pilasters sort of distributed around the interior, right, of these structures, then could be regarded as, points on the horizon, important points on the Earth's or village's actual or sort of cosmological horizon, right? Places where the Earth and sky intersect, sort of these significant foundational points in this larger geo-ritual landscape. So it's possible that Chaco and kivas are mapping out sort of a broadly comparable sort of relationship, sort of on the scale of a single structure. This is consistent, for example, with the Carrizoan view of kivas as representative of the greater cosmos, where roof posts are associated both with cardinal directions and trees along which humans ascended from the lower world or center place, which itself is represented by the kiva. Similarly, a Hopi archaeologist recently indicated that round kivas represent the circular universe and the celestial features by which the clans navigated during their migrations. So briefly, I just want to return to a point I made earlier, that the colors and materials in these deposits appear to have meanings on multiple scales. So, for example, blue-green objects in these special caches likely acted in accordance with sort of the intrinsic powers assigned to substances of these colors, right, in that society, which may have included like abilities to consecrate and animate. On another level, with respect to these world quarter directions, these objects may have acknowledged this sort of southern world quarter, right, in this quaternary or 6-part color directional scheme. On another level, and then more specific to the surrounding landscape, these blue-green objects tie court kivas to the southeast and to the south-southeast, this orientation, right, that's repeatedly cited in architecture of preceding periods. And so I suggest that this positioning might reference Mount Taylor as an important feature in the Chacoan cultural landscape. But finally, it's also important to keep in mind that blue-green objects are not restricted to these pilaster deposits, to ritual spaces, or even architectural contexts at Pueblo Bonito. So turquoise was also used for jewelry, right? It was used for adornment. It was interred in very large quantities with elite individuals in mortuary contexts. And it's consistently found, but sparsely distributed even in refuse deposits, say midden deposits. So suggesting that it was also used sort of in everyday contexts as well. So I think it's just important to keep in mind, that the roles of these materials, blue-green or other colorful materials, I think are situational. So kind of in sum, I'm suggesting that the color distributional patterns in Court Kiva pilaster deposits at Pueblo Bonito are conditioned by these interconnected aspects of ancestral Pueblo cosmology, the physical and cultural landscape of the San Juan Basin, and then also to sort of older Chacoan architectural traditions. All right, thanks. That's all I got.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. You answered a lot of my questions. Does anyone else have questions for Dr. Mattson about this information? And there aren't that many of us, so if you want to turn on your microphone, you can ask a question. I had one while we're waiting about sipapus. So sometimes, not all the time, our shell or turquoise or other materials in the sipapus directional. And a lot of times there's 4 colors in those sipapus. So I'm wondering if just your thoughts about why they would, I mean, I get the dedicatory, caching of this as being significant, but I'm wondering if you have any other thoughts about that.
I wonder if it's sort of referencing the sipapu as the center place. It seems that this idea of the center is really important in, sort of these, sort of the Pueblo sort of, models of the universe, right? Whether that center place is the village, whether it's, sort of again with multiple scales, whether it's the village, whether it's the kiva, or whether it's, even down to a certain feature in the kiva as the sipapu. I was curious, I was really only able to look at, right, these 4 directions, but given that we know there's this 6-part division, right, in terms of directions where you've got the above and below also, it would be wonderful to be able to capture that as well and see if those are also associated with particular colors or materials, Unfortunately, I didn't have a large enough sample size. I played around with like, because there are some even like roof deposits, not necessarily in the kivas, but in actual rooms in Pueblo Bonito. But I decided to just sort of restrict it to the court kiva pilaster deposits, just so I wasn't adding in too many different elements. But that's really interesting. Also interesting is that some of the pueblos have like a rainbow category, like a multicolored category. And, you know, I wonder if, you know, bringing together all of the colors could be related to that.
Yeah, it's everyone going into archaeological sites should carry a compass. And if you don't, you should. Because what Dr. Mattson is saying about directionality, you can almost always find, you know, coordinates of the buildings or the structures or long distance geographical points. And that goes for all over the world, right? You
Right.
find coordinates in these sites that you'll discover something for yourself, guaranteed, when you do that. Any other questions from anyone? Yeah, it's real interesting what Dr. Ortman said about the kivas being like a ceramic bowl and being like a basket, because it's kind of like it's full of life. Like when a bowl's full of food, it's kind of a metaphor for the kivas and for the pit houses. And I hadn't really thought about the basketry in the roof. That's great, because same thing, only upside down, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's a full basket that's a metaphor for life and the continuance of life, and it's so important for those people, because as you mentioned, other cultures have that 4-directional thing, like the Tzotzil Maya in Chiapas. They worship the 4 directions and the 4 legs of the turtle holding up the world in the Maya worldview. And you can look for all those parallels and all over the world about, I think in their ceremonies are like about the continuance of life. You know,
Right.
it can be as basic as that, by celebrating the 4 directions of the path of the sun, or, you know, whatever it is during the day. Anyone else?
Hey, Phil, I got a direct chat message question.
Okay,
You mind if I read it out?
sure, go
Okay,
ahead.
from Chris, if it's okay if I read it out.
Please do.
All right. Mount Taylor is turquoise mountain in the Navajo world. Super interesting. How do the Navajo directional colors match up with Pueblo Bonito colors? So actually, 3 of the quadrants do match up. So south also with blue-green, east with white, north, I think with black, north with black. And then I believe west is yellow. So that's the departure. So also similar. And also very similar sort of components of sort of the larger cultural landscape in terms of sacred mountains and landforms.
Yeah, mountains are really important in that area for obsidian, big time, right? It's all over the place. Anyone else? Here's any more thoughts about why different pueblos designated different colors in different directions?
You know, it's sort of interesting in looking into the literature on colors, there's sort of a couple different camps, and there's one that's very much into like the neuroscience of it, sort of in cognitive psychology, and this sort of like, why the fact that it's common across the globe to assign, various things, why is color such an important thing? Is there something in the human brain, right, that makes that association? Sort of what's common to everybody, cross-cultural, and then what's really culturally specific. So, I think that assigning colors to directions is a larger human pattern, and I don't know why people did that. I think it's super interesting. There's some old anthropological literature that talks about, especially in relation to like Paleolithic Europe, right? And like the color red being symbolically sort of primally associated with blood, right? Blood and fertility, and sort of there are sort of these deeply rooted, right, associations that cross cultures, right? And then other cases where, certain colors have certain meanings, and it appears to be completely culturally specific, why that is.
Fascinating.
Right. And a lot of times the sun, the path of the sun's associated, of course, with the east and the west.
Mm-hmm.
And you can have, if white is east, that's like sunrise, and if red is west, then that's more like sunset.
Mm-hmm.
Can be, in a way, just simply interpreted. But I was wondering about the ventilator shafts. They're mostly east, southeast, or
They're mostly south.
okay.
When you sort of look at a map of Pueblo Bonito, where all of the Kiva orientations are, sort of shown, I mean, they vary slightly, but they all sort of cluster around south. And I think, given the technology available at the time and the fact that they're building these within a larger structure, it's pretty amazing, I think, that they're as uniform as they are.
Yeah, I'm
Almost
wondering
all
if
of them are south.
yeah, that had to do with like functionality of the prevailing winds,
Mhm.
or is it more repetitive ceremonial over the centuries?
What's interesting is for earlier pit houses, they also have ventilator tunnels, and in this area, they are often, so San Juan, like central southern San Juan Basin, the ventilator tunnels are often oriented to the east or southeast.
Right, because they cache things in the ventilator shaft too sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So, it definitely is a ceremonial kind of sacred location for them. Were there any subfloor channels in those courtyard kivas at all, do you know, during excavation?
I don't know. I know that there like tunnels and things like that, or
Yeah, just subfloor channels like coming from the Sipapu or
oh,
a
I
lot.
don't know about. I'm not sure about that.
Okay, yeah. Because yeah, some of the kivas, I think it's drafting air, right, from somewhere, and it comes up through the Sipapu. Like they can change the direction of it to draft air into the structure.
Mhm.
Kind of strange, but yeah, I didn't know if they had any of those. Anyone else? Questions? Wait, there's somebody here, maybe. Okay. All right. Well,
I think there's one more, Phil.
okay. Do you see it?
The name says Janice Van Cleve.
Go ahead and read it.
Yeah, thank you. I used this raise hand thing to see if it would work. The Maya put yellow in the south, red in the east, black in the west, and white in the north.
What is that for?
The Maya.
Oh, the Maya. Mhm.
Maya, yeah,
And some speculation is that the east, of course, is the rising sun, red. Yellow is the south when it's in zenith, black in the west when it sets. And white was always a question, but people in the Maya area, that the hurricanes come from the north.
Hmm.
So
Interesting.
who knows?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I worked on a site. We had 14 burials. Every head was pointed towards the west. Every one. So talking about directionality, it's not, the point is, it's not an accident. Everything is intentional. How ritually people are buried, you know, what direction things are coming from. Right, exactly. I think Tenochtitlan too had a similar directionality pattern in some of their elite ritual burials. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of left up to interpretation in a lot of cases.
And I mean, given what we know, right, about, there's a question about Mesoamerican influences that, right, we've got, as Patricia Crown found, right, evidence of cacao at Pueblo Bonito, cylinder vessels, right, that look very, you know, Maya-ish, macaws, right? So we got copper bells from Western Mesoamerica. So there's,
Chocolate.
yeah, that there seems to be something going on with elites in polydactyly, right? It's like, and the 6-finger thing is also a big thing in Mesoamerica, right? There's this, so it seems like we find more and more connections over time. You know, so it wouldn't be surprising if there are some links in terms of color directionality too.
Yeah, it's interesting about polydactylism and dwarfs and all of that and Mayan art, you know, whereas we would think these people are somehow disabled. The Maya look at those people as special. Right.
Signs of divinity, right?
Exactly. They're the ones that are different and therefore special. And yeah, I like that part. I think that crosses a lot of cultures.
There's another question about perishables that might have been associated with these. That is an excellent question. And actually, there are a couple issues with that. So there are some of these assemblages that did have like, there'd be a couple seeds, for example, or like, you know, a nut shell or something like that, or some kind of vegetal material that was sort of hard to, you know, identify. And it did make me wonder if, you know, that was rare, but if that was more common and either it didn't preserve or, you know, the excavators 100 years ago didn't consider those objects worthy of collection maybe and omitted them. So it's hard to say, but there is some indication that they did include some perishable materials. Actually makes me wonder if some of, you know, what was even curated was maybe already picked through. But
Right, you never know.
Yeah.
I mean, now we collect everything, even all the dirt. and the collection techniques and methods were different, especially about botanical samples back then, huh?
What was really cool is that there are still some feathers that are preserved. Super neat.
Yeah, maybe even the feathers, the color of the feathers, right, have directional because there's feather bundles all the way back
Mm.
to our cake contest in caves. Actually kind of flickers and owls and, you know, whatever kind of feathers they were collecting.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, well, that's let's wrap this up. That was great. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure.
Interesting, I think, to everyone here. And appreciate your participation, everybody. So don't forget, May 5th through the 7th, the ASNM online conference. There's schedule that you'll be getting in the bulletin that'll go out tomorrow with all the speaker bios and abstracts. And it should be great. Should be a lot of fun. So thank you very much for talking to us, Dr. Mattson, and good luck with your research and your classes.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
All right, lots of thanks in the chat. People really loved it. All right, take care, everybody. Be safe.